to the Communication Studies podcast. My name is Justin Young. I'm a faculty member here in the School of Communication Studies at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. And my guest this week is Shelby Swafford. Hello, Shelby.
Hi, Justin. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. If you haven't listened to the podcast before, this is a podcast all about communication and all the different ways that it can manifest itself in our lives. Everything from things we think about like media, but also to things like interpersonal communication, but also how it affects different areas outside of traditional communication. And one of the things that we try to do in this podcast is make it very accessible to people who maybe aren't in academia. So you'll hear us at points try to explain concepts that maybe you're not as familiar with and everything, because we really want this to be as accessible and inclusive as possible. All right, so let me introduce my guest a little bit here. Shelby is a doctoral student here in the School of Communication Studies, and your current status is you're working on your dissertation?
Yes. Yeah.
So you are technically ABD?
Yes. I am ABD as of March.
Okay, congratulations.
Thank you.
So if you haven't heard that term before, ABD is all but dissertation. So she's in the final lag of this journey of hers, but it's the hardest leg of the journey, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Home stretch is the hardest.
Well, we all wish you well in finishing that dissertation and everything.
Thank you.
So to start off, Shelby, could you tell us a little bit about your background, where you're from and everything, and how maybe you got into studying communication just in general?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am originally from Florida, the Panhandle of Florida in Fort Walton Beach, a smallish beach town. Eventually, I made my way down to Tampa, where I attended USF for college for my bachelor's degree. And initially, I started as an English major. And I knew I wanted to write. I knew I wanted to read. But then I looked and I saw that they required a playwriting class, which is kind of ironic that this is what made me switch. They required a playwriting class, and I said, I'm never going to do that. And I switched to communication studies. I didn't really know what it was, but the classes I took so far in my general eds really excited me about it. It seemed like you could study almost anything through a communication lens. So I became a communication major at USF. I graduated from there in 2014 with my BA in relational communication. And then I just so happened to take classes with some of our alumni here, Keith Berry, and he encouraged me to look at SIU for graduate school as well as some other instructors I had at the time.
Our alumni always out there recruiting for us?
Always. Keith said, I think you'd be really good there. And lo and behold, 8 years later, I stayed for my master's and PhD. Carbondale is my home.
So I've got to ask, like you said, the playwriting class scared you away from the English major, and then now here you are doing performance studies.
Yeah.
So how do you make that transition to where this is the scariest thing in the world to this is your, this is your form of expression?
SIU and the Kleinow and our professors here and grad students here who did performance studies really just brought me in. It was, I got here and I knew that I wanted to do research that was more creative, that was more accessible, that really focused on storytelling. And I started looking at all the folks in performance studies, and I said, that's what I want to do. I was really, really lucky to have friends and colleagues and professors who sort of welcomed me into performance studies and said, you don't have stage experience, but you have something valuable to offer. So yeah, it's, in a lot of ways, it was SIU. It was coming to this program and seeing the amazing work being done on that Kleinow stage and going, I want to do that. That looks amazing.
Can you single out a piece or maybe a moment that really like galvanized you in that direction?
In terms of watching performance, I don't remember what year it was, but it was sometime early in my master's, and I'm watching all of this performance stuff. The first show I saw was Jason Hedrick's The Final Chapter of Nick Carter, which was this sort of surrealist play about media and earworms, among other things. And I just...
Earworms in the term of like a song?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so like the catchy song that you can't get out of your head?
Catchy song that you can't get out of your head. Maybe also a little literal earworm in this context. And I just remember thinking how cool it was watching my friends sort of transform on stage into these characters to bring these ideas to life. I also remember watching a couple of solo performances. The first solo performance I saw of Craig Gingrich Philbrook, who is one of our professors here, was in a faculty spotlight hour my first year. And I just remember thinking, oh my God, like that is someone who is completely in their element, and who is just channeling an energy that I wanted to be able to tap into somehow, some way. The energy of the stage, of that relationship with the audience, of telling a story in a completely sort of raw, open way, something so intimate but so public. It was sort of cumulative over those first 2 years in my master's, really watching people get up on that stage and transform and bring research to folks in a way that I had never seen research brought to folks before.
That's really interesting, using the term transform, right? Like the idea of appearing on stage being a transformative experience, that act of performing or acting, of being a transformative experience, is really interesting. I think probably what appeals to a lot of our students in performance studies, right?
Yeah, I would say so. When I taught our performing cultures class, CMST 201, a couple of years ago, my students were just so ready to just jump in to this thing that they had never really heard of or seen before, right? Because it's not theater in the traditional sense, right? It's sort of much more pared down. There's not big sets. A lot of it can be solo work, just a person on a stage or in a classroom with a block.
So maybe explain to us, what is the difference between performance studies and what I think probably most people traditionally think of as theater?
Right. So this is a big question with lots and lots of different answers, and people would answer it different ways. But
well, maybe give us your answer, and when we have other guests, we'll let them give their version.
So as I understand it, performance studies really comes out of the communication studies discipline, but also has a leg in theater as well. So there's sort of different ways of doing performance studies. We here at SIU are really a part of the communication studies tradition of performance studies. And what that means is that our roots, especially here at SIU, actually trace back to what's called oral interpretation, the performance of literature. So the idea was that we learn more about culture, about literature, about ourselves by performing the literature than we do simply reading it, by embodying it, by memorizing it, by putting it on our bodies, figuring out a way to translate that to people as art, right?
And when you use the term literature, you mean that fairly broadly, not necessarily just novels or short stories, which I think is what most people think of when they hear the term literature. So this is nonfiction and essays and those sorts of other formats as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There were sort of a lot of conversations in the early days of the discipline when we were still oral interpretation about what counts as literature, and really that expansion into, well, if we count nonfiction, why not memoir?
Right.
Why not personal stories, right? So that sort of explosion into what do we mean by literature into text broadly is where we come to performance studies. And the difference there is, our roots are in that performance of literature. We do more pared back, experimental, quote unquote, poor theater.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have a bunch of money to build big sets, to have big casts, to have fancy musicals with, multiple directors and stagehands and those sorts of things. We're much more pared back. And the idea is that we can sort of use our imaginations to use something as simple as a block and turn it into a million different things in the space of a performance.
For those who haven't seen a show here or seen something that might be labeled performance studies previously, the thing I think of is like a black box theater, right? If you've ever seen a show in a black box theater where it doesn't have the sets, it may have a few props, but it's people out there just acting, and like you're really having to get enveloped in that, right?
Yes.
But this may not even be a traditional story in the way that we think of it, right? A narrative play that we would think of.
Yes.
So it may be more a personal essay or something that you're performing.
Yeah, absolutely. They don't have to be a traditional play structure. We have had performances that maybe do take on that quality a little bit more, but yeah, they can absolutely be personal stories. They can be surrealist narratives. We've had installation performances where folks come in and walk around and see the performers doing different things in different spaces. So there's a lot of freedom in what we mean when we say performance.
Great. So I want to get back to the performing cultures class, because I think that sounds really interesting. Just the title of it sounds really interesting, kind of what you were talking about. So what sort of class is that? What goes on in a performing cultures class?
Well, it is by far one of my favorite classes that I've gotten to teach during my time at SIU. So students in that class do a variety of different performances, and they are based in literature. So going back to our roots of performing literature. So students perform a poem, a short story, and then a compiled script. And throughout the semester, they choose those texts based off of cultural location. So choose a poem that is written from the perspective of a culture to which you belong. Now choose a short story that's written from the perspective of someone who belongs to a culture that you don't belong. So how do we connect across difference? How do we perform that difference in a way that helps us understand and respect that difference?
And when you use the term culture there, sort of define for us like what that means in that context for that class. Or culture, I think most people think of racial or ethnic, right? Or is that in that context also meaning, hey, I'm in a Greek organization and that has its own culture, or I'm a football player and that has its own culture?
Yeah, so it's fairly broad and left open to interpretation in a lot of ways. I would say that it's sort of connected to cultural identification, right? In that maybe my cultural location might be one way of thinking about that. So that would be identity markers. So race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, class background, education background, religion, those sorts of things. But we can also think about it sort of on that more micro level. So culture, we might think of it as culture at SIU, right? Or, the culture of Greek organizations and things like that. Most of the texts that we have they come out of a compiled literature anthology. So there are texts from authors from all around the world in that book. So a lot of folks will interpret that based off of the text that they have in front of them. So that sort of helps them think about culture in this sort of way we talk about it as shaping our identities.
Great. Well, we do want to talk more about performance studies, but before we get to that, I did want to talk about, you taught a course that I think sounds really interesting, Multicultural Perspectives of Women, Gender, and Sexuality.
Yeah.
And you taught that as part of the WIGS program, which is Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies,
Yes.
which is not a full major here, but is a program that you can take classes and get a certificate at SIU. So tell us a little bit about the Multicultural Perspectives course for that.
That is an awesome class that students get to really, really dive into ideas about gender and sexuality and how they relate to other facets of our identity and our lives and our experiences in a deeper way than we do in just everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
So we spend a lot of time talking about the social construction of gender, how we create our own ideas of what gender means and then enact them or choose not to enact them.
Could you give us an example of that?
Yeah.
What does that mean when you talk about constructing our idea of gender?
So I think one of the classic examples is to think about children, and specifically, let's use children's clothing or children's toys, right? So from a very young age, we are brought into an idea of gender.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is if you are assigned female at birth, what that means in our culture right now in this day and age is often pink and princesses and baby dolls and easy bake ovens and kitchen sets. And if you're assigned male at birth, that means blue and trucks and superheroes and
G.I. Joe.
G.I. Joe, exactly. And the idea behind that is that while that might just seem totally natural and normal and neutral and necessary, to borrow the 4 N's from a professor, Kristen Langelier, in our field, while it may appear that way on the surface, it actually shapes a lot about our culture and our society, right? So that this idea that a boy means one thing and girl means another thing also shapes our ideas about sexuality and family, what families can look like or should look like, and what people should do. So the idea culturally that we've had for however many years now, a long time, that women are natural caretakers.
Right.
That they're the ones who are nurturing and should raise the children and be home with the children. That's a constructed idea of gender that really traces back to when we're born and before that.
And that really ties into career opportunities as well,
Yes.
traditionally, because we've had women as certainly as our elementary school teachers. That was traditionally seen only as a woman's job, nursing, really jobs about caretaking,
Yes.
like you're saying.
Yes, exactly. And that becomes harmful in multiple ways, right? Because then we don't see women as being able to be professors or CEOs or doctors or scientists or whatever. And also we can't allow men to be elementary school teachers, right? There's a stigma against that as well. So our ideas of gender as we construct them as a culture really are those constructions are meant to be limiting, meant to be restricting, to keep our ideas sort of in these clean, neat boxes when in reality we all know that it's not that simple.
Sure. How do students respond to that? Because just speaking from personal experience, that's something that often is touched on in my classes, but isn't the main focus of a class. That can sometimes be uncomfortable for students to challenge, something that, like you said, it's something that's been ingrained in them from the earliest of their age, from the moment they were born and they were wrapped in a pink or blue blanket. Do you suddenly have something like that challenged? And, it's not even that, to me, it doesn't even feel like that confrontational of an idea. The idea that, you can put that little boy in a pink blanket, it'll be okay.
Yeah.
That seems sort of a ridiculous conversation to have, but it can feel extremely challenging if this is the first time you're being approached with it. So how do students react to an entire semester of that?
Generally what I found is that my students craved those conversations. They might not have known it at first. It might have been a little bit uncomfortable at first. And I told them on the first day, it might be uncomfortable to talk about some of this stuff. We're going to talk about stuff that you might not have thought about in a way to challenge it. We are going to talk about sex and sexuality. We're going to talk about race. We're going to talk about class. We're going to talk about how all these things affect each other. And if I tell them that on day one and they know going into it, we're going to have these conversations, I've usually found that they go with me. They go with me on that. And I think in our culture, because we don't talk about those things, what I find is that students are often really wanting an outlet to talk about them. And we end up spending a lot of time talking about how these concepts work and affect our everyday lives, our experiences, our memories, our relationships, right? I've had students who've, taken that information back to their significant other or their mother or their aunt or their brother or their sister, and then come to me and say, it didn't go so well, but I'm really trying. And by and large, of course, I've had moments where students are really uncomfortable, but what I found is that if we open up the floor and say, let's just have the conversation, we're not looking for a right answer here. We're looking to talk about these things and see what our experiences are with them, and then how that fits into these sort of macro systems that seem so much bigger than us. And I think that overall, they've always seemed really hungry to learn that language, to be able to put to their own experiences.
That's great. All right, I do want to move on and talk about your research and everything.
Yeah.
I think we could talk about maybe that class individually for the entire hour, but I do want to talk about your research. And so your research has come, my understanding, in a few different ways. So obviously through performance at the Klein now and everything with shows that you have written and directed or co-directed. But it's also been through some panel discussions and papers and everything that you wrote. One of those being To Be a Mother, a Feminist Performative Autoethnography of Abortion. Wow, that is a tongue twister trying to get that all out. And so one thing I do want to point out is that you do have the M in mother in parentheses,
Yes.
so that you have the other of mother kind of set aside and
Yes.
everything. So I assume that is talking about the concept of the other. Could you explain that for us first, and then we'll talk more about the piece?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm looking at in that piece is our concept of sort of compulsory motherhood, particularly for bodies that are assigned female at birth, right? So because I'm talking about this complicated relationship with motherhood, specifically through my experience of abortion, I really wanted to highlight that otherness that sort of happens in this construction of womanhood equals motherhood. And if you actively choose not to be a mother, as a woman, as someone who is assigned female at birth, then you're doing it wrong.
Right.
Then you're doing it wrong. You're breaking the scripts. You are not following the rules. You're not fulfilling your destiny. All of those sort of things. So this idea of othering in this conversation of motherhood is really about sort of how we construct womanhood around the idea of motherhood and who does not fit into that.
Yeah, so you talk about choosing not to have children, but then, of course, there are also the women who simply can't have children,
Exactly.
right? And they're often, they're often treated the same way, which in a way is sort of doubling up on them, because here is something that, physically that they can't do, and carries with it all sorts of, unfortunately, stigma and stress attached to that, and then also being kind of piled on top of that, right?
Right.
With, oh, you're not doing your motherly duty, and in that case, they very much want to in a lot of situations.
Right.
Okay, so before we get into it, there's another word we need to define here, autoethnography, which is a word I think like a lot of people would stumble over, just like I did saying it, and I do every time I have to read it aloud. So what does that mean? Can you define it for us?
Yeah, autoethnography is a method of doing research that uses the personal, so that's auto there, the personal to connect with the cultural, so that's the ethno. Mm-hmm. So writing that is personal and cultural is sort of what we're looking at there. So it's using our personal stories to sort of connect to those larger cultural conversations that are happening about social issues, and seeing the connections culturally in our personal stories. I think a lot about the feminist motto, the personal is political. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of this idea behind autoethnography, that our personal stories have cultural and political implications.
And I think one thing we should make kind of clear with that too is that research, traditional academic research, is meant to be very non-personal,
yes.
right? Like there's a whole lot about removing yourself from the process of the research. Mm-hmm. And so this is really kind of a turning on its head, the traditional idea of academic research, right? Of putting yourself maybe not front and center in it, but certainly as an important part of it, a lens to sort of view this through.
Absolutely. I think it's making the implicit explicit, right? Mm-hmm. Because we're always in our research.
Sure.
No matter how hard we try to distance ourselves and to take out all the eyes, we're always a part of that research. So I think autoethnography really starts from that place that says, no, this is filtered through me.
Right.
Right? And it's going to look different if it's filtered through someone else because of their approach to this topic.
So, okay. So now we've got our terminology down. And I think it's really important with this piece, particularly because that title, like I like the mother, other in there and everything. So I wasn't even, when I was reading over it the first time, I kind of skimmed over it and just missed that and then went back. I was like, oh, no, okay, I see what she's doing. So maybe tell us a little bit about this piece, because I know this is something that you've talked about multiple times.
Yes.
And I don't know if this piece is the focus of your dissertation or how much it ties into your dissertation, but it seems to be an important piece that you've done so far in your research.
Yeah, so this one actually comes out of my master's thesis.
Okay.
So my master's thesis really shaped my research and my dissertation. Mm-hmm. My master's thesis was an autoethnography about my experience with abortion and womanhood and family and all of those sorts of things. So this piece came out of my master's thesis, and it's basically I sort of funneled down all of the bits in that thesis that really resonated in a particular way with me. That after I wrote them, I couldn't stop thinking about those stories. Mm-hmm. So this publication is in a special issue of a journal called Cultural Studies: Critical Methodologies, and it was about the theory, the practice, and the style of autoethnography as a research method. So this was my contribution to that. This was really the first time that I started experimenting with how do I tell this story mm-hmm. that seems untellable, because of all the reasons, because people don't want to hear it, because it's not seen as research, because it's not seen as appropriate mm-hmm. to talk about. And it's interesting. This is my first publication about abortion, and when it was published online, it got picked up by a random weird faction of like alt-right academics in Europe.
Okay.
they started tweeting about it.
Mm-hmm.
So it had a little moment on Twitter in this really particular circle. And I mean, it was one thing after another. This isn't research. How are they passing this off as research? No one cares about this, curse words, sexual history, all of those sorts of things. So it was weird because I feel like I've been so supported by telling this story in the context of this community here at SIU and the work that I do on the Kleinow stage. And this was my first go at like sort of expanding that beyond these circles.
Sure.
And I was prepared for that sort of response. I knew that was possible. But it was kind of a wake-up call in a lot of ways that like, okay, I have to really think about how I'm telling these stories and where they are going, because once I publish it, I have no control over where it goes.
The author is dead.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It takes the art takes on a life of its own. We won't get too much into Bart here. But yeah, that's really interesting because you say you're prepared, but also I have to think that nobody's prepared for going viral in that sort of fashion, right? Like you can expect to have somebody, I mean, you talking about abortion, you have to expect that there's going to be some negative reaction, right? We just know that from our culture. But to have a group of people on Twitter pick this up and make this their focus for a day or a week or whatever it was, right? That's got to be sort of a weird experience, particularly, you were just done with your master's at that point. So you were, you were still a very young academic in the grand scheme of things. How was that experience? I mean, what was it like in the moment? I mean, obviously now you can kind of look back and laugh a little about it, but in that moment it must have been a little weird.
Oh, it was. I remember I was sitting in my office, in the main office here in the comm building when I saw it, because I got like my altmetric score, which is the little number that they put next to publications that shows like how many times it's had impressions on like Twitter or Facebook or those sorts of things. It went way up. And I was like, what is going on here? So I clicked on it, and then I saw this collection of tweets, and I was like, who are these people? Some of them were not in English. So I had to do some translation. And I remember like scrolling through and reading it and going, oh my God, this isn't real, is it? And I went out into the main office where some of my colleagues were, and I told them what was happening. And I was like, so I think some people are picking up my article on Twitter, and it's not going so well so far. And it was just so surreal. I think I was in a little bit of shock. I just remember making a joke about, does this mean I've made it? Is this the sort of mark of a feminist activist when some people on Twitter decide that they're gonna voice their opinions in a really harsh way sometimes.
Sure, yeah.
So I think I was mostly in shock, and then afterwards I started reminding myself how many people whose work I respect have had that experience but worse.
Right.
And folks who were talking about queer issues at a time when we academically and as a culture just did not want to talk about that. And that sort of that sense of solidarity was comforting in a way, that like, okay, folks have been here before and they're still here doing this work,
right,
despite the risk.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's I think that fear, right, of that sort of response is what potentially pushes a lot of academics away from those sorts of topics, right? Particularly today with social media, because it can be so instantaneous and so overwhelming, because in a lot of situations it's very organized. Yeah. That sort of response. Obviously, it probably was to some degree in that situation. Those people were getting it out to people with similar thoughts.
all it took was one account who had, I think he had like 120,000 followers.
Mm-hmm.
One account tweeting that out to his, his followers, and then that's all it took.
Right.
It just took one.
So this piece then plays into some of the work that you have done on stage as well. So I believe it ties into the piece that you have coming up this spring.
It does.
Okay, and so I actually saw a very minor piece. Is that part of your larger piece?
I don't have plans to put that in the other show right now, and part of that is because the show that's coming up in the spring, while it's sort of about me and my experience, what I'm really interested in doing with that show is I'm pulling back pieces of shows from our Kleinow archives that have talked about reproductive politics in some way or another. So when I say that, I mean issues of parenthood, of sexuality, of family, of who is assumed to have children or not have children, who gets to be married or not, all of those sort of things, or this idea of reproductive politics. So I'm going back to our Kleinow archives, and I'm actually pulling back pieces from Craig Philbrook from our department, from Elise Pinot, who is a retired professor from our department, lots of other folks. So I'll be pulling some of their work and intertwining that with some of the work that I've done on abortion specifically, to sort of show how these stories are really connected. And they've been happening for such a long time. So the piece that I did in this last Spotlight Hour, I actually wasn't even planning on writing that. It just sort of came out after the SB 8 news. So I don't know what its future is yet beyond that moment on the stage.
Yeah, because it was so timely, and I just thought, wow, she was working on this, and then this happened, and this must have been such a, and I guess we should tell people what it's about. It's a piece talking sort of about, not in any detail, but talking about your experience with abortion, and then tying it into the Texas law, limiting abortion, and through multiple different ways. The most obvious that gets most press is the limit at 6 weeks, banning abortion after 6 weeks. But I was actually in the audience the night that you performed that, and I remember just thinking, wow, this is like such good timing. Like, she must have been thinking about this all summer and following this court case and everything. And to hear that you like really kind of put it together at the last minute in response to that, is even kind of more impressive. And so I do want to say here that I did watch that, and it was really great. I was super impressed by it. And particularly, I think what impressed me is, I think that a lot of people, the reaction would be, okay, this is something that gets talked about now. There are feminists out there who are writing about this, who are talking about this. This gets discussed more often than it used to in movies and other art. But it's still not common. Not as a topic to discuss, right? Like, it's common in that lots of women are having this procedure, but like, it's not common that we talk about it publicly. And to get up on stage alone, right? Not as part of a play, not that you have anybody there sort of shielding you, to get up there and, talk about this very raw emotional experience. And then to also tie that to something where that experience is being politicized, and certainly being talked about, and people are talking about it, maybe on your Facebook feed, or maybe, next to you in a restaurant with no idea about your personal experience, is really a courageous act. And, I know a lot of people would say that's not courage, but it is, because most people wouldn't do it, right? Most people aren't going to write the piece that goes out on Twitter and gets attacked, but like, at least there's some distance from you in doing that. but putting yourself up on stage leaves very little distance. I could have thrown my program and hit you from where my seat.
Yep.
Is how close we were. So what is that like? What is it like putting yourself out there in such a raw, vulnerable position, and particularly at that time with everything that was going on, at the national level?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, because I follow these court cases, this legislation stuff all the time. I have news notifications for these sort of things.
Like the Google News.
Yeah, Google News alerts for these sorts of things. So like I'm constantly following it, but I'm not always like in the mode where I feel like I need to sit down and write about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I woke up to the news about Texas SB 8, which is the most recent ban effectively on abortion coming out of Texas. I knew that had larger ramifications for Roe v. Wade and the legality of abortion
mm-hmm.
nationally. And I didn't know how else to describe it other than I just needed someone to listen. Even if that was just the page, I just needed someone to listen.
Mm.
I needed an outlet. I needed someone to feel the emergency, even if that was just me and my computer screen. I didn't even know I was writing a performance until about halfway through, and I sort of realized this is the mode that I'm going in. But I sat down, and it just started coming out of me in a way that sometimes news hits us, and if we are keen to write, we just want to write it out. So I didn't even know I was writing a performance. And then after I figure that out, I decide, okay, I wanted an audience. I'm going to give myself an audience. Mm-hmm. I've done this a few times already now. Most of my performances on the Kleinow stage have been about my abortion, mm-hmm. In cast shows and solo pieces. So I already had a comfort with the space, but there was this extra added layer of I haven't been there in 2 years. We haven't had this was our first live performance thing since 2019.
Right. So you've been shut down due to COVID, and there's been some recorded performances, but
right.
Nothing live with a live audience.
Nothing with a live audience. So I was sort of in this state of constant anxiety of here we are, we're going back, and I'm just throwing it all out there. But I think what sort of carried me through was that at the end of the day, saying those things felt necessary. And I have the privilege of access to this stage to be able to say those things, right? Mm-hmm. So I make that decision to take the risk that someone might come up to me afterwards and say some things. Someone might leave. Someone could throw things, theoretically. I've never seen it happen.
Thank goodness.
Yeah. I walk up to that stage with all of that in mind, but I think what makes that really possible for me is the community that we've built here that goes to those Kleinow shows. Mm-hmm. I know, there's a line in that performance where I talk about because my procedure happened during the summer, I didn't have to explain to my professors that I would be missing classes and why I would be missing those classes. Sure. And when I say that line, I know that my professors are sitting on the side of the Kleinow because that's where they always sit, right? So I can't see them because the lights are so bright, but mm-hmm. I'm looking at them because I know they're there. And that's sort of, every time I step on stage to talk about my abortion, I do a sort of like mental checklist of everyone in the audience who I know is supportive of me. I've seen these people here. I know they're here tonight. So I'm going to give myself that checklist, and I'm going to keep running through it. These people will be supportive. If something did happen, they would have my back. Mm-hmm. I'm not totally alone. I'm alone on the stage, but I'm not alone in that room. And part of that comes with the privilege of working in this space for the same 8 years. Mm-hmm. That I know this space, I know this community, I trust this community. That's a big part of it. when I perform at conferences, it's a much different experience because I don't know who's in that room.
Right.
Right. It could be random people who are like, I don't know what performance studies is. I'm just going to go see what it is. So I think that there's something about the Kleinow that really makes me feel like I'm taken care of.
Mm-hmm.
That even if something were to happen, I have a community of folks there who are going to support me through that. And that makes me feel safer.
Yeah, that makes sense. So kind of going off of that, I mean, obviously this is a topic important to you, and, you know, you are creating this art and doing this research as a means to get out to a larger audience, right? So given everything that you've done in your academic background with communication and everything, how do you think this topic, what do you think is the effective way to talk about this topic, to talk about abortion? You know, like I realize even we're sort of like this topic, we're using, like, almost avoiding saying the term in a lot of ways because it's not something that gets talked about a lot of times publicly. How do you go out and talk to a non-Kleinow audience, to a more mixed audience that in a lot of cases may not be as supportive, even if they're not antagonistic, may not be as supportive, and reach them, you know, in a persuasive way, or at least in a way to bring them where they can empathize with women who have had abortions?
I think that for me, the first step is to talk about it and talk about it often, right? The more we say the word abortion, the more it feels comfortable to say, right? And I think from that point, the more that I talk about it and the more comfortable I am talking about it, I find that the more comfortable people are talking about it with me. In that if I sort of signal through my body language, through my communication style, that this is a comfortable conversation for me, that I'm okay talking about these things, that people will sort of reciprocate that. And I've also found that there's something really, really powerful about standing in front of someone saying, I had this experience, rather than, you know, reading about it online or something. Because, and this is what's so powerful about performance to me, is because those people have to then deal with my humanity. The fact that I'm a person standing in front of them, telling this story, right? And that act alone, I think, does a lot to sort of work against the sort of monstrous ideal that we have about abortions, right? That people who have abortions are murderers. People that provide abortions are murderers. That, you know, it's an issue of morality and sexuality, you know. Even if they still don't agree with abortion personally, they have to reckon with the fact that I'm a person in front of them. And I think that when I have those conversations and I say, hey, I had an abortion, these are the reasons I had an abortion, but also reminding folks that people who have abortions, more often than not, statistically, already have children. They're already parents. They're already mothers. That abortions happen for lots and lots of reasons. Medical reasons, personal reasons, financial reasons. And that it's I want to get to a place where everyone feels like it's enough for someone to not want a child to have an abortion, right? But until we get to that place, I think that what's been helpful for me, especially with my students, right? I'm fairly open about this stuff because they've Googled me. They can find that essay. They can search me in the library and find my thesis.
They can come to your show.
They can come to my show, exactly. Go to a spotlight hour. You'll probably see me talking about abortion. So especially with students, what I found is that starting from that place of, okay, well, tell me what you think you know about abortion, and then we'll go from there, right? Because I think we have this idea that the person who has an abortion is just, a woman who is selfish and promiscuous and has no morality and is evil and all of those things, right?
Mm-hmm.
That sort of comes from that discourse of abortion is murder and all of that. But being able to say, okay, well, most people who have abortions are women. There are lots of circumstances in which someone would not want to have a child.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of circumstances in which someone could not carry a child to term.
Mm-hmm.
I have endometriosis. One of the side effects or complications with that is that it affects fertility.
Right.
And affects someone's ability to carry a pregnancy to term. So I didn't want a child, but regardless of whether or not I wanted one, that would have affected that decision, right?
Sure.
If it comes down to my life or the life of a fetus, I'm going to choose mine,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think most of us would make that decision.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's one of those areas where, when you look statistically, most people actually support Roe v. Wade statistically. Yeah. And I think that's exactly the reason why, right? Like I always tell students, it's not really a binary decision. Mm-hmm. It's more on a spectrum. And I said, there's very few people who are completely 100% on one end of the issue or another. Right. Most people find themselves somewhere kind of in the middle or, leaning one direction or another. And so when you talk about something like that, right, like your personal health issues, which again is like putting yourself in a very vulnerable position, right? Mm-hmm. We all have health issues, but we all don't necessarily air them publicly. And not even necessarily for privacy reasons or because we're embarrassed. It's just not something we talk about, and which leads to a lot of the sort of shame associated with reproductive rights, right? One of the things I've noticed with a lot of women my age now on social media, very openly talking about miscarriages.
Yeah.
And, like maybe not immediately when it happens, but very soon after, or even sometimes years after, being very open and honest about that, which feels like a radical shift.
It is, yeah.
So when you talk about this and everything, if you were going to talk to somebody about reproductive rights, or you actually use the term reproductive justice.
Reproductive justice, yes.
Okay. So if you're going to talk to somebody about reproductive justice, what are the tools from a communication perspective for doing that? So you've talked about sort of humanizing the issue, right? And attaching a face to it. Obviously, and I mean this in the most respectful way, you're a very non-intimidating person. I don't think people are probably that often like scared when they actually meet you.
Yeah.
You're not the monster maybe they have built up in their head. So, if you were to counsel people on talking about reproductive justice and all the different forms that takes, and maybe we need to define exactly what we mean by reproductive justice, but like, how would you approach, them and say, here's the way to like maybe communicate this better?
Yeah. So I'll start with reproductive justice first, because I think it affects how I talk about it. I use this term very, very intentionally because this is a framework that comes out of Black feminists working in the South, and they use it to mean the right to have children, mm-hmm. the right to not have children, and the right to raise children in safe, healthy, and sustainable communities. Okay. So those sort of three principles is what reproductive justice is sort of built around. So a lot of my work is in that right to not have children mm-hmm. segment, and I use those three principles when I'm talking to people about abortion, because I think that it's important to remember, one, that access to abortion is even though it's been legal, since Roe v. Wade has never been equitably accessible, and that oftentimes Black women, brown women, immigrant women, disabled women, poor women, they don't have the same choices of whether of motherhood or not, right? Whether it's because they don't have access to abortion, or because, especially in the case of disabled folks, because abortions are being forced on someone through things like conservatorships, that we have to realize that all of those things are connected, right? For instance, one of the implications, the side effects of these abortion bans is actually that it's been criminalizing miscarriages. That women who have had miscarriages can then be effectively criminalized if someone believes that wasn't a miscarriage, that was an abortion.
Right. The bounty system, which is insane to even talk about, the fact that we're giving these $10,000 plus bounties if you turn in somebody who's had an abortion. But that requires no proof to report this person. So this can be a woman who was pregnant last week is now not pregnant, and you just presume, but it could be, as you're saying, this person had a miscarriage, which they understandably might want to keep very private.
Right.
It's a very private issue. They're under no obligation to share that publicly with others. But we've now, criminalized that, or at least we're going to put that woman through this process of proving and reliving her miscarriage.
Exactly. And how do you prove something like that?
Right.
How do you prove something like that? The bounty system is effectively going to just clog their court system, and and we'll see the ramifications of that. But the effects of legislation like that reach far beyond just the intended targets, right? Of we're going to shut down abortion providers so no one can get abortions. Well, then we're effectively criminalizing nurses just working their jobs.
Right.
Doctors just working their jobs, clinic technicians answering the phones, women who've had miscarriages. The effects of that are so much more far-reaching than I think that the original legislatures intended it to be.
I know one of the things that I believe it was The Daily Show was reporting on was that Uber drivers were now refusing to take women to abortion clinics in Texas because they could be sued as part of that. So they were kind of, it's The Daily Show, so they were kind of taking it to its farcical end, which was that here's this restaurant that's located across the street, which is suddenly getting all these customers who show up to their front door, but are actually leaving and
walking across the street.
But one of the things you talked about was, the equitable nature of it, and I know some of the reporting coming out is clinics as far away as Colorado, and obviously more close to Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana are seeing waiting list essentially of women because all these women are fleeing out of Texas, which is certainly possible if you have the financial means to travel to another state and stay overnight and have this procedure. But there's a whole lot of women who can't do that.
Yeah, exactly. We've seen similar things here in Illinois, actually, at different points where Missouri at one point tried to criminalize abortion. They didn't quite get there yet, and I don't remember which restriction it was at this point because there have been so many. But one of the restrictions went into effect, and Illinois saw a surge of people coming into the state for abortion access. But the ramifications of that are that you can only get an abortion if you can afford an abortion. And that's essentially how it was before Roe v. Wade. Right. Women could get abortions sometimes, not always. But if you were connected enough, if you had enough money, you could usually find a doctor to perform an abortion somewhere else that you could fly to.
Right.
Right. Gloria Steinem very famously traveled for her abortion before it was legal. So we've always had that history, and then Roe v. Wade sort of attempted to really alleviate a lot of that, and for a minute it worked.
Right.
And then the restrictions started coming almost immediately. Restrictions started coming, and with more restrictions in terms of even things like hallway widths. There's these things called trap laws, targeted regulation of abortion providers. And they would essentially go in and measure the hallways.
Right.
And if the hallways weren't the right width, you got shut down. Right. So they were using anything possible that they could to shut clinics down, to the point where now Mississippi has one clinic.
Right.
In the whole state. Right. So people can't access abortions if there's one clinic in the state and it's 5 hours away.
Right. And, Mississippi is a very long state.
Yes.
And so, it's not a trivial drive from one end of Mississippi to the other. It's very much like Illinois here, right? It's a very tall state. So if you're at the Gulf Coast and going up to, up to the Tennessee border, that's a huge journey to make for somebody, particularly somebody who doesn't have a lot of money.
Absolutely. And even in states where access is fairly good, like Illinois, we have fairly good abortion legislation here in Illinois, fairly progressive, fairly protective of that right.
Mm-hmm.
And even here still, the closest clinic to Carbondale is over an hour away in Granite City. And an hour is a lot different than like a full day's drive or multiple states or things like that. But
Sure.
But still, if you've got to take time off from work and you've got to make that drive, what if you don't have a car?
Right.
So then you're dependent on, can I find someone to drive me there? Or can I afford a Lyft or an Uber to get there and back? And all of those things are meant to inhibit the access to abortion. Those states are actively trying to make it harder for people to have abortions.
Right. I do want to plug your show that is coming up here real quick. So it's titled Reproductions. It's going to be March 24th through the 26th. So this coming March. And are those is that a free production, or that tickets sold for that? Tickets will be sold for that.
It is $5 the student ID, $7 for the general public, and that is cash. And we are crossing our fingers that we are still going to be able to have it live in person.
Right. So there are COVID restrictions, we should state, for the Kleinow shows this entire year, have been requiring masks and everything from audience members.
Yes.
I did want to touch on real quick before we finish up here, because we're just about out of time. You did do another show, your last show that you were actually talking about, that was streamed online on YouTube, which was called The Muses Are Calling. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that show?
Yeah, that was a devised show, which means that the cast members actually wrote the script with me and alongside me. And we sort of took this idea of domestic labor, and what reproductive justice advocates would call reproductive labor, the work that we do to keep a society moving, right? Like raising children, taking care of the aging, cooking meals, those sorts of things. And what we did is we looked at that relationship to art. So how does that domestic labor, what we call women's work in our culture, how has that affected artwork? So we talked about our own personal experiences with that, some historical examples of male artists who have been violent towards women but are still celebrated, and also some women artists that we don't celebrate as much. So it's about an hour-long devised show. So there are poetry and stories and movement sequences, and there's a bathtub scene, all in less than an hour.
All right. Final question here. So something that I've been asking all of our guests, since we are talking about communication, right? And the most common way I think that people think of communication is through media often, right? It's what you're watching, it's what you're reading, it's what you're listening to, it's what you're playing. So what have you been doing lately that you would want to talk about?
So I'm a TV junkie. I love watching good TV shows. I've watched so much TV during the pandemic, and I'm going to take this opportunity to plug The Other Two and Hacks on HBO. They are the funniest shows I've seen in so long. Also, What We Do in the Shadows. I'm a big fan of the 30-minute comedy. The Other Two is perhaps the funniest show I've seen in the last 10 years.
Now, The Other Two is about the one brother is a pop star, and it's about his other two siblings.
It's about his other two siblings. It's got Molly Shannon in it, Helen York, Drew Tarver, and the little brother sort of rises to fame, and we see that happening, and then we really follow the stories of the other two siblings. It's the funniest show on television, hands down.
And that's really interesting because I actually listened to an interview with the creators of that show, and they were talking about how that show really ended up getting saved. It was almost canceled, and because it hit right during the pandemic, and it didn't really find its audience originally, and now has kind of been saved out of this and everything, which is one of those great stories when there's this show that has found a small audience, but a very, excited audience for it.
Passionate audience. Yeah, It was renewed for season 3 on my birthday the other day. So,
oh, wow.
Happy birthday to me from HBO.
And then Hacks is also an HBO show.
Hacks is also on HBO. That has Jean Smart, who plays sort of an aging woman comic. I'm actually wearing a T-shirt with her character on it right now.
Oh, I didn't even recognize what that was.
It's Jean Smart and her character Deborah Vance. She plays an aging comic who has this show in Las Vegas, and this younger sort of feminist comic comes to write for her. And it's really about their relationship and their dynamic, and is just it's so funny and smart and heartwarming. To see the relationship that these two women have over the course of this one season that we have so far. But I'm a big Jean Smart stan. I love her. I'll watch anything Jean Smart does.
Yeah, and also that show, I read that her husband died while they were doing that first season, and they thought the show was over, understandably. And she came back, a week later, and went back to work, and, really, saved the show, but also saved a lot of people's jobs and everything. Yeah. And, I can't imagine that experience from her perspective.
Yeah, me neither. And she did some of the most beautiful work of her career. Also, there's one scene where she plays her own wax figure, which is just mind blown.
Yeah, she's quite the amazing actress, isn't she?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, we're just about out of time, and I know you have some things to get to and everything. So I do want to thank you for taking some time out and talking to us and everything. And obviously, people can check out your shows and everything. Is there somewhere online, social media, or a website or something, if people want to find out more about you or your work, that they can go?
I have an Academia EDU page, but it's not very active.
Okay.
So I will say if folks are interested in learning more about performance studies or reproductive justice or wants to talk about abortion things, my information is on the SIU website, the Com Studies webpage of graduate assistants. My email is there, so feel free to reach out.
All right. And if you have any questions or comments about the show, you can reach out to me. My email address is justin.young@siu.edu. And we really thank you for listening, and we'll be back soon with another guest and continue talking about communication. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.